Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Reframing Public Heritage, a symposium organized by National University of Singapore, Nanyang Technological University, and in partnership with SAL Foundation and National Heritage Board. We will begin our symposium with a welcome address by our keynote speaker, Professor Lily Kong. Professor Lily Kong is the president of Singapore Management University and Lee Kong Chien Chair Professor of Social Sciences. An award-winning researcher and teacher, Professor Kong has received 5 international fellowship awards, including the Commonwealth Fellowship Award and the Fulbright Fellowship Award. Professor Kong is widely known for her research on urban transformations and social and cultural change in Asia. Her publications have covered topics such as cultural policy and creative economy, urban heritage and conservation, national identity, smart cities, and education. Let us welcome Professor Kong.
A very good morning again to everyone, and I'd like to begin by thanking Thomas and Lillian for inviting me to this symposium on reframing public heritage and for the honor of the keynote, which hopefully will raise issues and insights that spark off discussion later. So this symposium follows the launch of the WAMPO archives a couple of weeks ago, as I understand it. And I have visited the website with much interest, and it has inspired for me various lines of thought, and in particular in 5 interconnected areas. First, in terms of community and what it means for heritage making, this led me to think about public heritage and what that stands for. It also led me to think about alternative heritage practices. And because this was a project that dealt with essentially an elderly community, it also led me to think about humanistic heritage practice. And finally, of course, given the medium of, what the medium that you were using, it also provoked for me some thoughts around technology and public heritage. I will thus use these key themes as provocations for discussion. So first, let me begin with how the community is placed front and center in the WAMPO archives and the public heritage project that it represents. The archives contain a collection of stories told through objects by the elders in WAMPO. There remains on the website an open invitation to contribute to the collection online. Now, decisions about what places, buildings, and objects should be preserved or conserved have typically been the responsibility and indeed the privilege of experts. Experts such as art historians and architects, of curators and conservators, of heritage and museum practitioners and administrators, archaeologists, and so forth. This approach is premised on an implicit or even an explicit assumption that heritage is part of a vanishing past rather than a present and ever-living heritage. This primarily 19th and early 20th century notion of heritage requires that experts retrieve the disappearing traces of the past, something which a general public or the community do not have the expertise for and therefore cannot conceivably act on. And that is why we need the experts to act on heritage practice and preservation. The belief was thus that the experts alone can play a constructive role in heritage conservation. Yet, as we all know, practicing cultural heritage cannot be the exclusive purview of heritage experts. And so the so-called community turn in heritage practice emerged in the 1990s, first in the UK, and then spreading globally thereafter. And this community turn is an expression of the line of thought that practicing cultural heritage cannot be the exclusive purview of heritage experts. Heritage practice is ultimately values-driven and should be a matter of broader public concern involving community-based action. This forms the basis of the concept of public heritage. Heritage decision makers and managers must engage with and involve the public, the community, in identifying and managing cultural heritage. Indeed, every member of society should be able to exercise judgments about what and whether to preserve, to protect, to record, to restore, to commemorate, but also to ignore and even destroy those elements of their lives that could constitute a part of public heritage. In such a view, the community is central to public heritage, and authenticity and historical veracity are lived and perceived experiences rather than exact and absolute facts. So the Whampoa Archives, as a collection of stories told through the objects of Whampoa elders and stories told by the Whampoa elders, is a quintessential project in public heritage. It centers the community, its values, its choices, its stories. And in thus centering the community, it decenters the more common accent on the state of the private sector that have traditionally been able to ascribe heritage value to objects, buildings, sites, and traditions. Now, what I've painted thus far is the celebratory narrative about the community and public heritage. But it's important to remember that the community is multiple rather than monolithic. Using the term community can run the risk of conflating many different social groups and flattening the myriad individual experiences and memories into seeming equivalences. A heritage community may comprise esoteric advocates and diehard romantics or hardcore activists. But a community may well be the neighborhood community that Whampoa is, or the elderly community that forms the primary protagonist in the project that we are gathered to witness and comment on today. While the state, the private sector, and even the heritage community, in all their multiplicities, have wielded a certain degree of power in determining what constitutes heritage, very often marginal and marginalized communities do not. They tend to be excluded from the selection, the interpretation, and the management of heritage. Yet they have the potential to disrupt, or at least to interrupt, the canons of heritage that state, business, and interest groups define, control, and shape. The Whampoa Archives, with its contributions from any resident in Whampoa, gives voice to the ordinary member of a neighborhood community through valorizing everyday practices and items. And in doing so, it rests power, at least momentarily, in these residents. It also rests power, rests with a W this time, from the institutional actors in a rupture from the hegemony of more powerful players. To the extent that this is an uncommon occurrence, at least in our context, it deserves the attention and support of all of us. However, I'm also aware that we must not get carried away with the romantic appeal of community. I'm all too conscious that even this neighborhood community, as with other communities, is aspirational, is fraught, and is contestable, and indeed contested, possibly. And these are words that I borrow from Martin Mulligan in his writings about community and heritage. Public heritage projects can address the contestations and lead to reconciliations, but they can also be the very source of contestation. I remember a piece of work that I had done many years ago that had to do with the making of a particular exhibition at that point in time in the National Museum of a particular minority community in Singapore. And in as much as it valorized the community and gave them a sense of existence and being and recognition, it also led to contestations within the community as to what deserved to be represented or represented. And so to the extent that this project could have been a project in community making in and of itself, it also could have been a project in contestation. What indeed was the experience of the making of the Whampoa Archives? As Mulligan also argues, community is always impermanent and incomplete. And so if community is essentially an ageless human aspiration, always waiting to be realized, did the Whampoa Archives contribute to this aspirational journey of community making? And if so, how and with what effect? I would suggest, therefore, that in addition to the making of the Whampoa Archives, an ethnographic inquiry into the very making of the archives would give us insights into the intra-community dynamics, its aspirations, its contestations, and its reconciliations. Let me turn next to the question of purpose. The Whampoa Archives live in cyberspace, and to the extent that content in cyberspace can be deleted, it is true that there may not be longevity. But while content in cyberspace can be deleted, it is true that there is a greater chance of inclusivity and longevity than perhaps heritage preservation in physical space can achieve. But before we think about the longevity or the desired longevity of such a project, perhaps we need to ask the question why heritage management strategies need to assume and privilege preservation as a desired outcome. I found myself asking why the team embarked on the Whampoa Archives project, and I would love to hear from the team. Was it an exercise in preservation? Or was it an exercise in building community for which the archives was an instrument, not an end in itself? Or was it an exercise in contributing to elder well-being, again with the archives as instrument rather than end? I am not entirely certain, but let us assume for a moment that the project is as much about heritage preservation as it is about other objectives, some of which I ventured a moment ago. Let me then share a recent view that has emerged in the scholarly literature about how the preservation impulse may not be the only management strategy to recognize the significance of heritage. Here I quote the work of Caitlin De Silva at some length. In a provocative book titled Curated Decay, she suggests that such curated decay may be a valid alternative to preservation. What implications would such thinking have for the Whampoa Archives, and more importantly, for the community that it foregrounds? To what end is the curating of Whampoa Archives targeted, and is it a way of thinking beyond preservation? Now, I guess we should ask ourselves, what does Caitlin De Silva mean when she introduces the notion of curating decay, which she did in her 2017 book by that same title? She begins by pointing out that heritage preservation, as commonly understood, involves maintaining some site or set of artifacts in a condition that recalls the time period in which they were in everyday use. She rightly points out that with the exception of well-funded places, many examples of our heritage are effectively ruins, the remains of past buildings or places, and things that for whatever reason have not been well preserved, but rather left to decay. We could consider within this realm old housing estates, derelict playgrounds, half-used artifacts. All of these could belong to that category. Caitlin De Silva encourages us not to lament these sites and artifacts as lost, but to consider possibilities for preservation that embrace the decay and the dereliction. Might an old estate like Whampoa fall in this category? I'm not sure, but it's certainly something for us to think about. De Silva's alternative ethic to preservation is grounded in collaborating with, rather than defending against, the natural processes that occur, whether in nature or in communities. Now, how does this actually translate? She argues that instead of seeking to preserve, concepts and practices, alternative concepts and practices might be considered. And she puts forward a few which I cite here. Should we consider some kind of orderly decay? Should the Whampoa archives be considered that while the community continues to live its rhythm and maybe its retreating presence, that the archives is a way of capturing that decay in an orderly manner? So would that be a form of orderly decay? It's a new, her curated decay is a relatively new way of thinking of this. And so I suppose we're part of that journey of thinking through her concepts and whether what we're doing add to that concept, modify those concepts, or exemplify those concepts. Now, besides orderly decay, she introduces the notion of positive passivity, as well as advocating care without conservation. So would, caring for what exists and capturing it in some form without trying to conserve those practices and places be a part of curated decay? I'm not sure, and I would love to hear the discussion about it. So I leave these thoughts with you. Is the Whampoa archive a way to allow curated decay? An open question for discussion, perhaps. Now let me turn to the fourth of the provocations that the Whampoa archive represented for me. This turns to the community which is at the heart of this project, the elderly folks in Whampoa. What is an interesting line of inquiry for me is how they can benefit from the project. Heritage practice can support communities and positively impact individual and community well-being. This interest may be characterized as a humanistic approach to heritage practice. Faye Sayer cites the work of the New Economics Foundation in the UK. And this was a work that was done in 2008, the New Economics Foundation work, where qualitative research showed that there were 5 actions and activities that enhance the happiness and well-being amongst the population. I can certainly see how these actions and activities could be rooted in heritage work and form the foundation of guidelines and best practices for heritage projects that might be interested in enhancing the well-being of a community. Of course, these actions and activities can also be rooted in other kinds of non-heritage related work as well. The 5 types of actions and communities that can enhance happiness and well-being in the work of the New Economic Foundation were as follows. How do we make and strengthen social connections? How do we involve the community in physical activity? How do we help them to become curious and aware of their surroundings, learn new things, volunteer or contribute to their community? Now, these were generic kinds of actions and activities that the New Economic Foundation, through their project, found enhanced the happiness and well-being of participants. And when I looked at this, I thought, this very well could work with heritage projects, even though they weren't speaking particularly about heritage projects. And indeed, I ran through my mind the Whampoa project, and I thought, there was all this possibility and perhaps reality of contributing to the well-being of the community. If heritage projects are developed as social practice, community social practice in this case, and provide the substance for social activity, then we can see how active participation in heritage stands a chance of enhancing individual and community well-being in all of these ways or in some of these ways. Sayer suggests that heritage professionals can work with those in the arts and public health, where there is well-developed, long-standing experience with engagement techniques to provide wider benefits and value for communities and individuals, including mental health services and greater inclusion of marginalized or minority communities. She goes on to suggest that the positive social impacts include well-being indicators such as the following: building confidence, team working, forming relationships and making friends and breaking down barriers, not necessarily just amongst themselves, but with the people who are running the projects. Reintegration of disparate groups back into society, reducing antisocial behavior, improving communication skills, developing a feeling of ownership, developing a sense of community. As I watched elements of the WAMPO archives online, I thought to myself, how well has the WAMPO archives been able to generate a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging, to connect people to the present by using the past? How well has the WAMPO archives, perhaps as a project, a heritage project, acted as mechanisms for personal and communal interaction with one another and with the environment? Has it contributed to some form of team building, of building confidence, of building relationships? Is there potential for this project in public heritage to serve as a social practice that impacts public health and well-being, and in this case, particularly of the elder community? So just as an ethnographic examination of the making of the WAMPO archives could be very valuable, as I intimated earlier, equally valuable would be an ethnographic understanding of the participants' experience in the project. Let me now turn to a different direction and focus on one last provocation that the WAMPO archive introduces for me. The WAMPO archive relies on technology, and this opens up a question about the role of technology in the making of public heritage. The instantaneous digital communication that is enabled by new digital technologies opens up new opportunities for the making of heritage and its dissemination. With technology, our experience of cultural heritage becomes multimodal and mediatized. There is definitely promise in the wide reach, offering unprecedented and widespread access and valuing of heritage. This can only be a good thing. However, scholars have also pointed to ethical issues that have emerged with the use of technology, such as leading to the further downsizing of cultural institutions in some countries, and the reduction of heritage to an entertainment medium for some, and hence a certain trivialization. Let's explore the promise and downsides of the digital in public heritage. Clearly, the digital holds out promise for curating previously hidden or marginalized histories. At the same time, digital heritage work can help to mitigate, sorry, I can't read my own handwriting, to mitigate societal problems such as isolation and even dementia. Further, public heritage work through digital platforms enables citizen science and citizen humanities initiatives. And there's a whole literature about the benefits of that. These intersections of the public, of heritage, and the digital definitely hold promise. And more than just promise, there have been evidences of positive effects. One of the game changers in digital technologies is the turn towards the use of social media. As Jenny Kidd points out in her work on heritage and the promise of the digital, social media communications moves us from a broadcast or transmission model of communications by heritage institutions to one that is perhaps less hierarchical and exclusionary. It widens the audience, it reaches new constituencies, and it allows more democratic participation in the construction of heritage and also in the enjoyment of heritage. To quote her further, they foreground sharing, conversation, and debate, lowering barriers to entry into those debates and offering the potential for impressive reach and a diversity of voices. But on the other hand, critics also point out that communication within social network sites tends towards fatigued small talk rather than meaningful conversation or debate. So while social media may extend reach and quantitatively appears effective and impressive, it says nothing about the depth or quality of interactions from either the user perspective or that of the institution. Now, another approach enabled by digital technologies is the crowd-based method, or I should say crowd-based methods in the plural, which perhaps the WAMPO archives approximates. Crowdsourcing, the practice of inviting members of the public or the crowd to tag and classify, to transcribe, organize, and otherwise add value to digital cultural heritage collection content, is the most common approach to crowd-based methods. It is said to open up knowledge production and assumed to produce a more representative, more authentic, and more genuinely public heritage. But scholars also challenge the positive rhetoric about crowd-based methods. Critiques center on issues relating to outsourcing the work to members of the community in unpaid ways, the exploitation around that, and the undervalue and even devaluing of the work involved. I'm not suggesting this in the context of the WAMPO archives, but certainly in the context of public heritage institutions like museums and public and private galleries which rely on this, one can easily see how labor issues come in. So if we come back to the WAMPO archives, I ask myself what considerations went into the choice of technological interventions used by the WAMPO archives. What kinds of impacts were desired through the use of technology, and have they been achieved? But were there unintended consequences? And how might these be mitigated? This points again to the value of having the WAMPO archives as the subject of ethnographic study in itself, and the participants the subject of further ethnographic analysis. Let me summarize. Visiting the WAMPO Archives website was a very interesting experience for me, and I thank the team very much for this very interesting work. There were familiar objects, memorable sounds from my past. They provoked for me a sense of self and identity, of childhood, of growing up. But they also provoked for me a range of intellectual questions, and I have organized my presentation today around those provocations. Questions about community, about public heritage, about alternative heritage practices, about humanistic heritage practice, and about technology's role in public heritage. None of these are straightforward, and none of these are unequivocally positive or negative experiences and practices. To the extent that this framing around the 5 provocations is helpful in furthering conversations about the WAMPO archives, I offer them to you. Thank you very much.
Good morning to everyone. My name is Thomas Kong, and I'm one of the key members in the WAMPO Archives project. Over the next few slides, Peter Chen and myself would like to share with you the background, the context, and making of this digital archive. It began in 2016, or perhaps in 2015, when I was still teaching at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I spoke with Mary Ann Sao, the chairperson of the Sao Foundation, on the possibility of holding a series of intergenerational activities in WAMPO that will bring the elders and residents together. And in the process, we were hoping to change the public perceptions of aging and also of older person. So together with Susanna Harding and her team from the foundation, we submitted to the National Heritage Board of Singapore a proposal called Curating Whampoa. And over a 2-year period, we held 11 activities, and one of them was tangible stories. In this project, a Whampoa elder, Jessie, told me that she was planning to sell her 4-room flat and move into a senior studio apartment. She was hoping that the profit from the sale would let her live well in her golden years. But at the same time, Jessie was also saddened that she had to throw away many of the things she collected over the years. And obviously the new apartment was too small to hold her collections. I came up with the idea that perhaps we could reach out to organizations and people who wish to take care of Jessie's collection. And I was really lucky that the Asian Film Archive and Tang's departmental store responded to my request. The 2 photos on the right show Jessie sharing with the CEO of Tang's her collection of the departmental store's paperbacks and other memorabilia while she was an employee of the store. In fact, that was the only company she worked for in all her life until her retirement. At the end of the conversation, Jessie gave her Tang's collection back to the CEO. Afterwards, when I asked how she felt about the whole experience, it was interesting to hear what Jessie said. She remarked that she liked the fact that she had agency in determining the next life of her collection. It also enabled her to connect with an individual who had a strong relationship to her former working life. And it allowed her to share her past experiences with him and hopefully to leave a legacy. During that time, I was also talking to Prof. Siu from Hong Kong Poly U and artist Samson Wong on how to archive and sustain a collection that may not necessarily fit into the mission of a typical museum. Thinking back on our conversation in a Tartan Tang in Hong Kong, and also Jessie's experience, I came up with the phrase social curating and archiving. And on the left, this is a brief description of it. So last year, my colleague, Dr. Lian Qu, my good friend Peter Chen, and myself put together a proposal to NHB called Social Curating and Archiving, from personal possession to public legacy. What we hope to do is, and also perhaps address some of Dr. Kong's provocation, is that we like to examine the relationship of legacy building, cultural heritage, and aging in Whampoa. And through this project, we wish to position curating and archiving as social practices to support the formation of a public legacy through the sharing, learning, exchange, and renewal of an elder's personal archive on a digital platform and a film. The project sees the archive as an opportunity to explore notions of memory, history, meaning making, as argued by Katie Carbone in her book, Archival Art, Memory Practices, Interventions, and Productions. At the same time, we were also inspired by anthropologist Arjun Abadurai, who asserts that that archiving is a collective everyday social project. Therefore, it is an intervention, an act of imagination in anticipation of collective memory. And the word in anticipation is really important for us. And therefore, it is also future-oriented. And we hope the archive will help older people in Whampoa to connect with past experiences, relationships, and identity as described by Tara Coleman's and Janine Wild's essay, Being with Objects of Meaning, cherished possessions and opportunities to maintaining aging in place. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Pete, who will share with you more details about the digital archive.
Hi, good morning, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm Peter. So I've worked with Thomas for the past since 20 years ago, So I'd like to thank Thomas, for inviting me to be part of this project. I'm also an architect, and now currently I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Art, Design and Media at NTU. So I'm all the way over at the other side now. I'll do a quick share of the operational part of our project documentation. Okay. These are a few of the legacy objects that we worked with the elders during the curating Wampo period. Okay, back then we made a series of images. We photographed the objects, much like that, in a purely documentary or rather a documentational style. We interviewed the elders, and of course we took photographs, portraits of the elders. So some of the examples here are like a porcelain pillow. That top center image is of actually a baby carrier. We had trouble trying to identify what it was. Some bus tickets, a lot of sewing machines, several examples of sewing machines. And the top right is this sort of zinc bathtub, that this actually belonged to Jessie, the elder that Thomas was mentioning earlier, who worked for Tangs, her whole life. So that was one of her objects. And then these are sort of the sort of character of the objects. They have a certain age to them, and they are basically they have really been in possession for a many number of years with the elders, and the elders are now kind of at the point where they're not quite sure what to do with them. Okay, so we documented this back in 2016 to 2018. Right. Go ahead. Now, fast forward to 2020, and this was part of the social curating and archiving part of the project that NHB awarded us. This part, we sought to build a virtual library of these objects. So we wanted to capture them virtually. This is an image of a couple of images of the project team documenting the objects to build as 3D models. This is either done in 3D scanning with a 3D scanner or through photogrammetry. What you see here is this sort of portable photo studio that we transported to the elders' houses, and it's usually done in the corridor or in the lift lobby. Okay, this project did go on during the pandemic, so it was very, very tricky. We had to take the objects out, and of course, we had to deal with elders. So we had to bring the objects out and then document everything outside of their apartments or outside of their homes. And this went on for, I think, a good maybe 4 or 5 months. Okay, and this was later on made into models, virtual models, which you see here. Okay, so that's an example of a mortar and pestle. I think most of us are familiar with what this does. Okay, and we built these models with photographs and 3D scanning, and uploaded them into an online repository. Okay, in this case, Sketchfab, right? Something like that. So with this 3D model, we can do basic manipulations. You can zoom in and out, right? And you can turn them around, So right now, we have a whole bunch of these models on this online repository, okay? And I think and we did that, consistently over several months. Here you see some other examples, like the porcelain pillow, the bus tickets, even flat work like that. Paper we made into, excuse me, we made into models, okay? Uploaded everything. So we would do the same thing for each of these legacy objects, okay? The bus tickets, porcelain pillow, they all look like that. And then we had this sort of collection now. We realized that it kind of ballooned into this collection of I think we have 70 over objects, okay, in this archive. because we broke them down individually. Okay, and it's a nice collection right now online, and and I think the Thomas his vision was always to actually have this as an accessible website where people could contribute. Okay, the legacy objects, these legacy objects that you see are just kind of like the starting point. Okay, they were the ones that we had to work with in the beginning. Okay, and then as we move on, this is the kind of like the archive of all the objects, and we structured them into what you see now is the website, the Wampo Archives. And in here, we have the collection of everything that we've done over the past 4 years, like the elders' portraits, the stories, the objects, and the 3D models, all in sort of in a collected resource. But more so than that, we've actually expanded this website to actually include, if you see on the top right hand, there's a contribute button. And if you go into that, later we'll put up a link, like a QR code. Hopefully, some of you will scan that, and then you will access this website. And what we are doing now is to request from the general public if they have any sort of legacy or heritage objects to contribute. And I mean, if they would go through the website, they would see the type of objects that have been collected so far. Maybe something they would contribute would be in the same vein, or maybe not. I think Prof. Kong's earlier keynote would actually captured some of that, as to who kind of defines or who kind of directs this sort of idea of public legacy now, or public heritage. Okay, this is kind of like I think it's a mind map or roadmap of the legacy projects, kind of like in the middle there, and then you see different objects that are being contributed and how, I won't say how far they are from the legacy object, but just how different they are, and then they start to form these other object clusters, if I'm not mistaken. And that's kind of where we are now. Okay, we have this sort of website, and we're reaching out sort of to the public to contribute the legacy project, well, their own legacy and their own stories now. Okay, to sort of build up this this virtual resource. I'm going to stop here, and I've also stopped calling this. I think we call it an archive. We've stopped short calling it of an online museum. It's not really that sort of a collection right now. But I think an archive is a nice starting point right now, reaching out to everyone. Okay. I will hand over. I think the next slide is basically, yes, this is basically a link to the website. And if you scan this, you would go into our website, and it'll have all the collections and stories and the photograph of the elders. All in all, I think we've managed to we interviewed about 20 over elders, and the collection of objects, each one of them would have, some of them had just one, some of them had more than that. So I think the number of objects numbered 30 something, okay? And that hopefully will set to grow, okay? So I do encourage everybody to visit our website about the Wampo Archives, okay? And I think that's it for me. I will hand over to Lillian.
去买嘞，看有没有中，今天拜山。你看我们收这些东西。
Good morning, everyone. So across 4 homes in the Singaporean inner city suburb of Whampoa, several elderly residents introduced themselves in English, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Hokkien, recounting their life stories sparked by the objects they hold dear. An in-progress work, Objects for Thriving, is a collaboration between architecturally trained filmmaker Ian Munn and myself. The films are conceptualized as observational and essayistic video documents, propositional attempts to understand how memory is constructed and sustained through objects kept in the home. The objects are taken as sites where the structures of feeling which sustain everyday life are deposited. They enmesh protocols, systems, and technologies of survival and belief. The cultural critic Raymond Williams introduced the term structures of feeling for literary and film criticism in 1954, where he argued that the intricate formations of taste and feeling were important cultural indicators of a historical milieu. The strategic vagueness of structures of feeling is not an anti-theoretical term. It installs a theory that respects the constant worldings we find ourselves a part of, and a commitment to a radical empiricism, which prioritizes a corporeal life. The concept concerns elements that have to do with events still unfolding, patterns in formation, that which awaits analysis, but also enables action. Objects for Thriving challenges the formalization and abstraction of heritage. It claims a space in the domestic sphere for individual, familial, and kinship notions of an affective heritage, tied to the typically unremarked complexities of everyday life. The ambition behind Objects for Thriving is not to possess authoritative knowledge. Rather, it attempts to conceptualize our roles as what the architectural historian Kush Patel calls communal custodians. The term refers to person or persons caring for an evolving heritage archive of heritage objects still being used and tending to the recording of lived histories still being experienced. Following the object as aid memoir, knowledge is gathered from what is said, is not said, as much as from what is. Objects for Thriving relies on the collaborative and the contingent. The view is of heritage as a form of becoming, intrinsic to the incommensurate and unexpected textures of the lived everyday. Many of the participating elders are second-generation China migrants to Singapore. Hence, some of the objects they hold dear have thus acquired a transnational status. These are heirlooms passed to them for safekeeping by the previous generation. The presence of these objects in the Singaporean home demonstrates the porosity of domestic space to the physical and metaphorical movement of people, the remaking of these selves, and the multiple sets of memories constructed across the evolving life stages of their owners. The objects structure the meandering pathways of time and space, navigate cities tied together by migration, and register the accompanying experiences of assimilation, settling, thriving, and aging. Through the elders' fragmented accounts of their objects' origins, significance, and sentiments, one is invited to be curious about where these objects may have been and where they could go beyond their current custodians. The theorization of heritage, born within a domestic context, happens in the fine-grained narration of stories and scenes. A tailor's ruler, for instance, presents superficially as a wooden stick that has lost its function, marked by measurements that no longer bear utility to contemporary life. The object's value is instead symbolic, a 100-year-old heirloom passed down from the owner's mother-in-law as a symbol of luck and a reminder of virtue, the virtue of humility. The ruler reminded that the then newlywed couple to be grounded as they started on making a home. The object's aura emanates not from an interview with its owner, but in our individual and collective acts of coming to know their significance, paying attention to their situated archival sites, that is, their roles in the domestic realm. In Objects for Thriving, the prominence of things as lived is significant. And here I'm reminded also by Prof. Kong's convergence of this idea through her introduction of K.P. De Silva's term curated decay. Through them, through these objects, prospects instantly open. A granite, mortar and pestle, a clay pot, a sewing machine, fortune charms, and a tailor's rule. The objects are things which do or did important work, much of these associated with a reproductive domestic labor of care. Instead of relics which confer an expiry to them, it is more useful to think of these as things which have a place in the world. The writer Robert Macfarlane reminds us that the etymology of the word thing does not only confer to a study object, but also its still unknown narrative. These objects prompt us to concede partial knowledge or to anticipate gaps in our knowing. The artist-philosopher Aaron Manning calls this mode of knowing speculative pragmatism. Speculative in the sense that the process remains open to the more than, and pragmatic in the sense that it is completely invested in its something doing. This, we hope, is what Objects for Thriving will do. By locating these things within the multiple layers and changing meanings of a domestic space and a public heritage, their significance speaks of the evolving intersections we perceive and live through, both as individuals and as connected publics. Thank you.
We can now move on to the panel discussion and Q&A session, which will be moderated by Dr. Lillian Chi. So we'd like to welcome our panelists. Firstly, we have Susanna Harding, the Senior Director of the International Longevity Centre Singapore, an initiative of the SAO Foundation. Next, we have Associate Professor Siu King Chung from School of Design in Hong Kong Polytechnic University, who is also the co-founder of the Community Museum Project. We are also welcoming Siddhartha Perez, curator at the National University of Singapore NUS Museum.
Let me just show this slide about the vision of COMSA, which is the Community for Successful Aging program model that we have been piloting in Whampoa as part of the foundation's work towards supporting the community and the elders to age in place. The vision has always been that a community that takes collective ownership of positive aging and healthy longevity over the life course to reap maximum dividends of longevity. With that, let me offer a few thoughts. First and foremost, I really enjoyed and I learned a lot from Prof. Lily, and her provocations really made me reflect more on how the whole Curating Whampoa and this Whampoa Archive project has always been part of the COMSA overall program model and how we are implementing it. As you know, the foundation believes that growing older has a lot of potential for opportunities. And starting from a very negative perception of aging in older persons, we wanted to shift the mindset, how to embrace aging as a process that would allow opportunities that older persons can continue to thrive. And that's, I think, one of the essence of this project as well. So we wanted to debunk a lot of myths on aging. So this project, this is the end in sight. This is where we want to go. So Prof. Lily mentioned, is it a means to an end or an end itself? So in a way, this project is a means to an end. And what's the end? We wanted to shift around from a negative to a positive perception of aging. We also wanted to empower the older persons from a very marginalized group within the community to an empowered group of residents that they can actually be at the center of some of these, not just as participants or as an observer in the peripheral, but also in the center stage, taking some of the initiatives themselves and actions. And we thought this Curating Wampo would be a very good vehicle for that. We also wanted to build social capital among the elders and an opportunity for intergenerational bonding. Arts, heritage, and a museum always inspires people to connect both at the individual as at the community level. And it creates social capital. And of course, Prof. Lily is correct. The well-being overall is also one of the, we see that this project contributes to that end, to be able to have a better sense of well-being among the elder. So it's both, so it is a means to an end, but it is also an end in itself, I think, because public heritage and what you say as orderly decay, I think it is a very good concept. How do we find a means to kind of put a process to that decay in the community, so that then there was opportunity for regeneration. I think that's, so the idea of community museum is something that we kind of enjoy and like as a foundation. We also wanted our elders to become actually potential community curators, to tell the stories of their community, to tell the stories of how they are growing old well in the community, and hopefully inspire other estates to embrace some of these activities. We also talk about age-friendly environment as part of the successful aging. So this project doesn't just talk about the physical, but it also talks about the social environment, the connectedness, the social connectedness, the objects as well as the lived experiences of those who owns those objects. I think that's something that's also important. But there's also one element of this as a connecting to the future, the idea of thriving in the midst of mental, cognitive degeneration, frailty, both at individual. How can people, older people, despite those degeneration, can actually still be connected to the future? And I feel that this curating and social archiving is actually a good way to do that, connect them to the future, continue to thrive and then as elders, as active participants and contributors, despite some of this degeneration, and hopefully inspire the next cohort of older persons to use it to regenerate the community and their own aging experience, to redefine how they would want to age well in the community. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. This is really a rather complicated project, I would see, given that all these idealistic notion of curating and archiving, and also the things at the operational level. What I mean is that, okay, we seems to be trying to doing a kind of technological re-infrastructuring of archiving, I would say. So this is one level. So how do we, instead of housing things in the museum, how do we put things on the web, which allows perhaps more possibilities? And then we have to explore this kind of possibilities in the future, right? So this is at one level, the re-infrastructuring of archiving, what the project is now doing with the photographing techniques, new photographic techniques, and also the preserving of the image or the digital data This is one of the very fundamental conditions that we need to consider properly, uh, for example. But at another level, I would think that we also have to think about the notion of meanings. As far as I could now think of, there are at least 3 or 4 levels of meanings in the archive. Okay, the first level of meaning is, I call it object owner's meaning, right? The owner possess the objects, and that in their lifetime it develops a kind of personal meanings on it. So we have to deal with this kind of meaning at one level. When it becomes a kind of legacy, then the object is transferred to a collector. Maybe Wangpo Archive as a collector, or maybe a personal collectors like what Thomas Kwong has just shown of Susan. Is it Susan, right? Jesse's objects. So this is the object owners, objects collectors meaning that we have to deal with. What kind of meanings they will generate from this kind of relationship. And of course, if both the owner and collectors are still alive, then we have another level of meaning, which is collectors and owners meanings. How do they work together to develop another level of meanings, which we hope would be positive and generative? So this is one level. So you could see that there is a triangle of meanings going around. So this is the basic units of an object that I would envision. But if you put all these little triangles together, it becomes a network of meanings, which we do not yet have a means to define yet. And I call this a public meaning, so-called. The public meaning could be about nationality, or about communities, or about humanities, or whatnot, or about families. So this is very fussy yet, and but I think the project has allowed this kind of potential through technologies to build this network of meanings in a way that maybe Professor Lily Kwong has prescribed how to promote this kind of happiness and well-being, right? Not only for elderly, but for the next generations, in terms of learning, in terms of regenerating some kind of new intellectual properties, or further, or future visions, this kind of things. So my image of this Wangpo archive has the potential of these little triangles coming together into a bigger network of meanings, which perhaps could be of positive humanistic values. But we are still in question marks, okay? Whether the technology could really allow it, or whether we could generate enough motivation or incentive for people to build these triangles into a bigger network. I have been talking to Thomas about maybe it's through a kind of game, like cross-generational game, using a 3D game engines to build your website instead, right? So these are all the potential, but of course, as Professor Lily Kwong pointed out, there also has a dark side of all these technology, and we have to be very careful about this.
First of all, I'd like to thank Prof. Lily Kong for her wonderful keynote, and also congratulations to the team for launching the website, and also for showing us the trailer of Objects for Thriving. I think that's very exciting. In consideration of this general project, this WAMPO archiving project, I'd be more interested in the ways in which the life of objects journey through different hands and also spaces in time. So I think what happened here, what we've seen this morning alone, is the different scales of expression of affect, like how this community, the objects as well, that in give us an inference of objects, histories, and also this life of objects and their affect. It's shown in these different expressions by the project team. So maybe one of the, like curatorially, it's also something that King mentioned, and the 4 levels of meaning are an interesting, 4 points to consider. But I would also like to say that if we can consider these different levels of meaning, right? There's a constant interface anyway with the bigger public kind of hegemonic encounter and stories around these objects, around the social history of objects, and making meaning out of objects or things. Consider, one, the narratives that they are embedded into. So these are the originary sources in a way. And then the spaces of representation, right? From homes and curio vintage shops to museum exhibitions and even museum storage. And who are these agents that mediate these objects? Meaning these are the traders, the researchers, the curators, collectors, the families, and the community themselves. And I think, in a way, how can we consider this term curating, that we've also mentioned a couple of times this morning, as an approach to address the liminality of these objects as they move between these components, from the agents, from the spaces, and the original resources. What is the potential to that? Like, can we take advantage? Can we consider the priorities at the moment of these different components, even on a national scale? If we look at museums and institutions, it makes me think of this project, this show in the Singapore History Museum, so the precedent of the National Museum of Singapore, where 6,000 everyday objects were actually accessioned and were exhibited on site. Right? And this was the time that we could consider that there is suddenly a space or a priority for the so-called national heritage of the cultural life of Singapore at the time. But what happened after? Like, we can even think of these objects, have they seen the light of day beyond that exhibition? But it seemed that once that's acquired and exhibited and accessioned, what happens to their afterlife? Like, they are kept in the storage at the National Collection. And then how does this change in its reception and the reproduction? So in a way, what are the changing ideas of legacies that WAMPO archiving project is looking at this moment? Maybe that's one of my questions. And I'm also curious in the approach of soliciting contributions from the public. And with these objects, they have such mass appeal in a way, like publicly. These are something that are interesting to different generations, is cared for, and then they move always between, they fulfill both use and symbolic values. But when we're soliciting contributions from the public, what sort of public are we asking from? Because if the subjects or the originary sources of these objects and these stories are an elderly community in a specific site, is the whole digital technology also accessible and available for them? Or how then does the curatorial approach, how can they manage that? How can they manage to continue this the story? And yeah, so those are my questions, and I appreciate that there is a conversation about these alternative ways towards heritage. And it's also interesting to note that museums and institutions as well change with the different priorities. So they're also complex entities. So curators also have different approaches, different methods. They interface with very specific publics, and that is why this project, Wampo Archives, is a very important step to show different approaches, or at least an alternative way of considering a specific community.
I would now like to invite all three panelists, Susanna, Prof. Siu, and Sid, as well as Professor Lily Kong, to join us for our Q&A session now.
Maybe I can start by kind of sort of perhaps summarizing, but also just together, perhaps also to give a bit of our responses to the questions that have been raised. Yeah. So Lily brought up 5 important points, which was what is the idea of a community, and about its the difficulty of saying that, to use that term, because it appears monolithic, and the community might be multiple, it might be fractured. There could be very many ways of thinking about it. And when we use that, as with all other terms, there are pros and cons to it. There was also this question of what makes public heritage, and also the idea of the public here again is contested. Who makes it? Because someone has to make it. I mean, surely, as we have seen even in this one, the 3 of us are doing together with Ian, we are initiating some decisions, and obviously the decisions do not rest completely on the elders whom we collaborate with. And I should also say, I think that Thomas and Pete will also have this comment to make, that it was very difficult. It still continues to be difficult to persuade people, to persuade participants to become part of this endeavor. Okay? You might be able to talk to them. There might be relationships which are already made, but the moment they are put into some kind of public pedestal, it becomes a whole other project altogether. People back off. And therefore, even if Thomas has already made many, through his many years of working there, he's made many of these relationships, it still becomes difficult when, and many have backed out, when we say, can we come to your house to film this thing? We are not able to even, some say you can come once and we talk to you, and after that it's hard to go back again. So access is a problem. And this idea of public heritage that everyone wants to participate is probably, it's probably an ideal situation which does not really exist. The third point Lily brought up was about third and fourth was about a humanistic approach and practice to heritage and alternative approaches, which I think that this particular team is trying to muddle through. But at the same time, I would say that we are not curators, right? We come in with different kinds of skills and ambitions. Pete obviously has ability to think of how to present these materials in the best possible way and to model them. Thomas has a long-standing interest and investment in the making of communities and also working with the elderly. And I'm interested in domestic space, but also thinking that domestic space is also a publicly formed entity, which we don't realize. So we all come in with these different ideas and we intersect at this point called public heritage or the making of heritage. And therefore we bring with it, as Sid just mentioned, as like different curators do, we bring into this endeavor different agendas. And these agendas may not neatly intersect. They produce in themselves tensions. The fifth point, which probably is how this thing got to be made despite the pandemic, is that we use digital methods. And as we probably have seen over here, there is no matter how good Zoom is, there is some level of distance between the subjects or the objects and the viewer. There is also, I guess in many ways, there's also the education of a public towards this mode of the digital heritage. And the points which were brought up with by the panelists all intersect with Lily's keynote just now. And I was thinking of what Sid said when Sue talked about the object owner's meanings and the 4 levels of meanings and the life of objects. And Susanna was talking about how how a particular project enables the continued life of this community. And I don't know whether we set out to, when we do these things, we set out to achieve so many different, because all these things come out in the midst as when you are doing it, and you come across whether these are problems that we have to solve. And obviously from the point of the people who are doing this project, it is problematic when somebody tells you, no, I don't want to do this anymore, and I cancel. And then you have them and you think like, oh no, from 6 has become 4, is it enough? So we are dealing with it at a level of problems. But I guess as Lily has shared with us, probably a meta ethnographic evaluation of the impact of the process on the participants, and also from the level of how it has impacted our ability to curate a large enough group of things and a large enough group of objects coming from a public that kind of discussion has not been had. I mean, it has been dealt with on our level as a series of mini crises or mini problems that we need to solve and we need to supplement. But I think these are real problems which intersect a lot of the questions that each of you have brought up. This term curating that we have used, right? I mean, curation always tends to be the best curations tend to be very focused. They tend to have a very clear delivery of a message. And it's interesting what, as people have shared, because when you put something like a term called public heritage, and these things, as I said, they are still being used and the lives are still being led, that the term curation, which suggests a very controlled way of delivering a message and of representing this, a group of things, then becomes contested. Because when these objects travel, I use the term as transfer, I think Sid mentioned it, travel between different agents, from their owners to us, to the digital realm, to a public. And then after that, and that question has also been asked, what happens after this project finishes, right? Who will take over this thing? Where will these things go? So this has also, again, been, this kind of question has also been addressed more as a logistic question, but it is actually an epistemological and ontological question of what happens after this? What happens to this thing? Because there is a problem, herein is a problem, because firstly, the objects have a value insofar that they are attached to life stories. They do not have a value in and of themselves because they are like 1,000 years old, or they're the only ones in the world. Because as Pete said, he found many sewing machines. So why one particular one? It's not one sewing machine. So how do we deal with these questions of that intersect this idea of curating, which is already a contested term, but then it comes to a series of objects which completely, I wouldn't say dismantle, but they destabilize this term because of the nature of the objects and where they are found, and the changing ideas of legacy. Okay? Because if we don't, even if between the team members we have different ideas of legacy, what more between publics and communities? So I wanted to also bring up 2 points here from the perspective of people who are working on the ground. There are also funding priorities, right? And I'm sure that we to fulfill KPI, to fulfill the outcomes which we have to list down, we also have to be quite clear about what we can deliver. Okay? And by doing that, we cut off quite a lot of the in-between and vague intersections, which could be very interesting. We would do that in a report, and that might come across in different ways to different stakeholders, that it is actually quite neat, but it isn't. And then there is also this idea of education or a public outreach of who makes heritage, and perhaps in future there could be a way in which that when someone else starts a project like this or continues this project, that the resistance towards participation may not be as great, or that people actually understand actually our objects, everybody's objects, when they are selected, they obviously have a value. So I also think that the participants themselves, they are reticent, rightly so, because I mean, to suddenly have a spotlight and be put on a public pedestal is very unnerving. But there's also this uncertainty that how can something which is so ordinary be of interest to heritage or a museum or any kind of national collection? Because there is already an ingrained belief that a national collection constitutes something of very specific national value, and does an ordinary person have that kind of thing to contribute? Okay, so there needs to be an overall overhaul of outreach and education to think what it means to leave a legacy and heritage. So I would either the panelists and Professor Kong, who actually had many questions for us, and I don't think that we can answer all of these things. I also want to invite Thomas and Pete to respond to some of those questions which were asked.
Thanks, Lillian. I think, as everyone began to talk and unpack this notion, the many different notions, ranging from heritage to curating, archiving, and all that, and of course, Lily's very provocative keynote, I think definitely the ethnographic examination and methodology and understanding is a very important part of the whole process. When you're in the midst of doing, right, you have to deal with contingency, as Lillian mentioned. Not only just the curiosity of what these things will be, you have to also throw in the pandemic, which really was a big factor in how we have to manage, how we have to be sensitive and also mindful, especially when we're working with the elders. So a lot of them were very cautious and quite apprehensive. And it took a while for us to really have a chance to, finally step into their flats. So thanks to Pete, to Ian and others, we managed to, you talk about KPIs, to NHB, the generous funders. Yes, we have met the KPIs. I think that's something that King Chung brought up about the circulation of objects, right? And as it circulates, meaning multiplies. And that's really wonderful for me, in the sense that I think there was also a question, what happens next? So we are in the discussion with Holy Innocents High School and also Bendemeer Secondary School, which is just round the corner in Whampoa, to get the secondary school students to work with this collection, to use it as a kind of a virtual museum project, and to engage an elder in their family or maybe a relatives and see how that collaboration, that intergenerational learning that Susanna mentioned can bring about a different interpretation again, right? During the Curating Whampoa project, we also work with SOTA students, NUS architecture students as well. And it was wonderful. Unfortunately, given the time that we have, I wasn't able to show you some of the amazing reinterpretation of this legacy objects, as Pete mentioned. And they were very poignant, they were very beautiful, but at the same time, they were very embedded into this whole notion of aging, identity, meaning making of objects, right? And the process of co-curating with the elders. I remember there was once where the SOTA student, he had to help clean up one of the elders' home because of his immobility. And even before he started doing his artwork, every time when he visited him, he helped him to clean the place. And this wasn't in the art curriculum. But nonetheless, that was part and parcel of how actually through that process of cleaning came the idea of using the dust for the painting. So hopefully we will have very amazing, equally amazing and memorable works with Holy Innocent High School as well as Bendemeer. I'll leave it as that. As Lillian said, I think it will take me several weeks to unpack all the questions that Lily has posed to us, and I'm so glad that that she has done it. Thank you, Lily.
I hope I didn't sort of raise more questions than you would have liked, but they really were very interesting things that came to mind when I was thinking about the project that you were doing. As you were speaking just now, something came to my mind. I had to give a talk yesterday at some QS President's Roundtable, and the topic was in part about how do we value social sciences and humanities work, and what can we think of as ways of assessing that work rather than just, the usual publication, citation counts, and those sorts of things. And in the process of preparing for it, I learned something new from my students, actually. They were doing a project with a couple of, with one economics professor and one, I think public policy professor. And they were working on something called the or they were using a methodology called social returns on investment methodology. So, it's intuitive. I just don't know what goes into the methodology itself. But the idea was that, public agencies, whether it's the National Heritage Board or Ministry of Health or MSF that's interested, say, in the well-being of elderly people, invest, and they invest financial resources. But at the end of the day, what we're interested in is what are the social returns from that, in terms of the well-being of the community and so forth. And it just occurred to me that if ever there was to be a follow-on study, but this time not of extending the archive, but studying the process of making the archive, studying the process, the process of making the archive, but also the impacts and the benefits that the participants might have taken away from it, such as, a sense of agency, which Thomas, you referred to. Those are the kinds of social returns that we are not so, well, at least I'm not so used to assessing and giving assurance that investment has been well made. So I throw that in the mix in terms of different kinds of methodologies that might be interesting to consider at some point in time. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. I thought that was interesting because return of investments, or ROI, was instituted across universities in the United States, primarily during Obama's administration, where he talked about when you get funding for your projects, that is an investment and a return for the university. So this putting of the term social in front of the ROI, so SROI, it's interesting because there is actually a return, and that return could be possibly larger, and it reaches a much larger group than the university per se as an institution benefiting from the monetary funds that come into the university itself. Yes. That's very interesting. Was there any kind of paper or publication that came with that?
I'm not sure. I think they did have to do a project, and there must be some outcome, a write-up about it. I'd love to lay my hands on it, and if I do, I'll share it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I like to connect this idea with the notion of social curating as well, because okay, there's two concepts. Social curating is one concept, and archiving is another concept. Okay, to relate it to the South Foundation or the mission of South Foundation, I think we are thinking of, when I talked to Thomas years ago about these ideas, is that we are thinking of curation as a different process, rather than collecting like physical objects and make meanings of it. We are also collecting human relationships, and hence we think of social curating as a kind of process curating. Like I use the word workshop-based curating, right? So which ties in quite well with the South Foundation's workshop with the elderly. We use the objects as a means or an excuse to create events that the elders and the teenagers or the collectors talks together. I think if we really take seriously about use this notion of social curating idea more seriously, perhaps the curating process is about workshop-based curating, and hence through which we could discover meanings. Okay, discovering meanings is what we are aiming for, and how we could document those meanings or connect those meanings to different generations is through our technology that we are conditioned to do now. So maybe we could step ahead a little further about thinking of curation not only as dealing with the objects. How do we curate people in order to make meanings together? And then at the next level, how do we document those meanings or use those meanings to generate further meanings? I think this is perhaps the key or the crux of the idea of social curating and archiving.
I remember during the Curating Wampo event, I remember King Chung, you ran a Wampo Eats workshop.
And the cooking workshop, right?
Cooking workshop. And what was really fascinating, unfortunately, I was still in Chicago at that time, but what I saw from the images and what Susanna and the rest told me was a really fascinating sort of intergenerational relationship building, right? When you ask them to work together, right? An elderly couple with a secondary school student from Bandimia, and they have to go to their homes, and they also need to get the ingredients. And this is something that I believe some of the secondary school students might be a big discovery for them. Then on the other hand, they have to also work together to put this presentation of some kind, right? So for an exhibition. And that's where the secondary school students sort of had an edge in knowing how to lay things out and all that. And then they were learning as well, from what I can see in the photos. So that reversal of role, right, at some point in your workshop was really fascinating for me. And then it all came together when they had to talk about their recipes and their food in public, right? And then it has a different sort of public value as well, because it's broadcast to a wider audience. So it made me remember about what you did when you talk about curating social relationships as well.
But I think at that time, okay, social curating is a process, but archiving is also another process. So if we did not have the technology or the logistical means to do the archiving, then the thing could be a one-off event, right? But if we can come up with a new technologies to document this kind of process at a process level, not only the physical object level, then there are lots of possibilities. But I think what we need to do for the archiving part is to come up with some new means or new angles to record what those relationship and meanings and generative knowledge could be.
I like Prof. Lily's suggestion of the ethnographic study, and to really understand, perhaps say a research around that on how the whole process has impacted. We actually have done an evaluation of the community development, of which the first phase, of which Curating Wampo was part of that, but not specifically on the project itself. So I think that's something I would like to explore, how we can do that. And yeah. So for me, it's more of like, okay, I'm trying to listen very well, and then It's very interesting.
Since we're talking about objects and meaning, I think what's important to recognize as well is that we're encountering a certain kind of rhetoric, right, or a languaging. And in this project, it comes through in different ways. I know Prof. Lillian talked about the ways where the film is directed within the framework of affect. So it goes beyond the objects in a way. So it goes through different forms, different kinds of transformation already in the encounter of this, of the people who have them and also the objects. But in terms of the rhetoric or the bigger languages, the parts of our conversations today when we talk about institution, the bigger hegemonic ideas of heritage. I also wonder if that's a interesting thing to address, if it is a very conscious and deliberate thing that the project addresses too. Because in terms of this idea of access and also providing a chance to even like have an intergenerational dialogue, but what happens after we generate this knowledge systems or this new information? Because I refer to, maybe I found two quotes actually in relation to that Singapore History Museum exhibition that I was talking about earlier that was staged in 1994. And that was for the anniversary, and it was by the Ministry for Home Affairs in terms of situating why these objects were in the national consciousness was interesting, because he said we are what we are today only with the participation of the man in the street in every sphere of life. So he urges older Singaporeans to share their memories with the youth so that they may treasure Singapore's fruits of success. And then on the other hand, at that time, as part of this institution's project or priority towards everyday objects, there are also conversations, there were interviews, right, with these traders, with these people who have these objects or donated these objects. And the one that was interesting was by Ayuan, who is a Karanguni. So this is the quote. So in the past, being a Karanguni was considered a lowly job, and they only collected old clothes and scrap metal and newspapers. The job is now a higher status. We are called recycling heroes. As recycling heroes, we contribute towards the preservation of history too. So it's also interesting because the terms of this, that's nestled under heritage, also changes. And I wanted to just leave with that.
I think there are two main themes probably here that have been brought up that require more thought. One is the question of value. The value of something, of a project like this, and how it might be funded, whether it's funding research or curating the the curation of it. What Lily brought up, the social return of investments, that at present does not have a framework to be measured and still lacks any kind of way to quantify directly, because we can't quantify it. And the problem is when you can't quantify something, you lose it, it's ephemeral. But that doesn't mean that it is actually not valuable. The other thing is about the anointing objects as having legacy to a public. And Sid just now brought up the question about the change in titles as immediately changing the status of the person who holds the object and the whole action of generating these objects itself, like a Karanguni person suddenly having an anointed value for at least temporarily while the exhibition is going on, and where this title becomes fashionable as part of heritage. There is also the question of the use of technology, of archiving, which Prof. Siu brought up, how do we use it and our engagement with that? Does technology give more access or does it devalue heritage? Because when you go to a museum and you have that encounter, is it very different from if we see it on the website? And because there are lots of people now who are doing social history. They are putting out their experiences, there's blogs. Is there a difference? How do we value these things? Next is the question of language, which intersects what Sid just said, the rhetoric of it. And then there is the language of the idea of what constitutes a national collection. This is a rhetoric too. And it seems, we discussed this with the panel some weeks ago about that there is a question, there is still this tinge of sentimentality and nostalgia, which personally I am trying to avoid. And I have discussed this with Ian. We have gone through this. I mean, what you see, probably you must see a very different version of it when it's completed. We try as far as possible, because sentimentality and nostalgia is only useful for the people who understand those things through their life experiences. It can become very prohibitive for people who have no access to the same experience. And therefore, it's this language of the sentimental and the nostalgic. Should it even be there? The idea of curating, the language of curating, changing it into a process as a custodial act, which will require the changing, recognition that it will change hands. And that also continues the legacy and the continuity and the afterlife of the objects and the people who are doing with it. The language of curating audiences and publics, as well as curating objects. How do we reach these audiences? Curating social relationships. And the last point is the question of dissensus, public dissensus. That public dissensus, having a discourse, is as important as having consensus. Like we are over here, we actually will disagree. Maybe we have not said it yet because we're very nice to each other here, but we will disagree with some of the things that each of us have said. And that disagreement is as important as the consensus, because that disagreement brings in the notion of a public, and that there can be many versions of this. And how do we document this as a discourse? And so that discourse also continues the idea and the legacy of a public heritage. So with that, I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Lily Kong, for sharing a very provocative and I would say lots of for all of us to think about. For our three panelists, Susanna Harding from the South Foundation, Associate Professor Siu Kin Chung from Hong Kong, all the way joining us today, and Siddhartha Perez from the National University of Singapore Museum. She's the creator there. We thank all of them and all of you in the audience. Thank you for staying with us on a Saturday morning. And with that, I would like to close. This is always a very awkward way to close a Zoom seminar where we all suddenly leave. But we hope that some of these questions and the images will stay with you for a little while. And please do write to us. I think there is Arena, could you please put in the link for them to contribute their objects to the website? And there's also the website itself, which you probably have seen if you were able to register. There was a poster that came with it. Please do contact us if you have questions or you have anything to contribute, or you have would like to talk to us or would like to participate in the project. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.